After our dad really started to get into making fretted instrument strings in the late 30s, early 40s, he had a little hiatus where he had to move to Philadelphia and work as a flight mechanic for the war effort because he had 3 children. He did get drafted eventually and went through boot camp, but then the war ended. But when he came back, he was really energized to grow the business and learn more. One of the first really big opportunities he had was with Mario Maccaferri and the ukulele strings. Mario was an Italian immigrant who immigrated from France. Mario ended up becoming a second father to me and one of my mentors. And he was, a luthier, a classic guitarist, engineer. The guy was multi-talented genius. I think he had well over 100 patents in his name too. Mario dropped out of school at 9 years old and at 11 began to apprentice with a famous luthier and classic guitar teacher, Luigi Mozzani. He was located in Cento, near Bologna, where Mario was born. He became quite a violin and guitar maker, won many gold medals for his instruments, but he also was really becoming quite a classical guitarist, and Luigi took him under his tutelage. He became quite a concertizer. Next thing you know, he's second to Segovia playing classic guitar in Europe. He did have an accident swimming while making a movie and hurt his hand, and he never quite played at the same level after that, so he did not want to tour as Mario Maccaferri. He came up with the idea of touring as the unknown guitarist, and he would wear a cape and a mask, kind of looked like Zorro. Mario had quite an imagination, so he was one of these people that was a problem solver. So if something was a roadblock, he came up with another way of doing it. So that was his way of keeping his performing career without tarnishing his name. From there, he began to make more instruments, and he moved to Paris. And I think it was by 1932, he began producing the Selmer Maccaferri gypsy guitars, very famous for the cutaway. It was really the first production cutaway guitar. And Django Reinhardt used that guitar almost exclusively. He only stayed there a few years, and they were making reeds in the same building, and he saw the machinery and immediately imagined a better way of making the machines to make the reeds. They were constantly sharpening blades. Tool steel blades wear out very quickly. Cane is tough to cut because the bark is hard and it wears the blades down. But he came up with a way of making a wheel with several diamond cutters on it, and they lasted indefinitely. He was the first one to utilize diamond cutters to cut reeds. Now we cut our Dario woodwinds and Rico reeds with diamond cutters today, but Mario pioneered that in the 30s, which is quite remarkable. And ultimately, when the war really accelerated in 39-40, France was occupied. He got on the last voyage of the Ile-de-France. He didn't even have a ticket. He dressed up in a tuxedo, got a limousine, took his guitar, his suitcase, drove to the front of the line. The line was 5 blocks long, everyone trying to get on that last boat to America. Walked up, talked his way on, told them that he was a musician, he was supposed to play, and he was doing a show, and they gave him a ticket to get on. He shipped his machinery first to his brother in England and then to America, and he started the French-American Reed Company here in America. And they were manufacturing very high quality clarinet and saxophone reeds. In fact, they made the original Rico reeds for the company we would eventually acquire in 2004. And his reeds were great, but then during the war, the Germans were sinking cargo ships and they would not ship any cane from the south of France to Mario. So he had no cane, and he had contracts for reeds for the army, marching bands for the war effort. And he was at the 1939, he went to the New York World's Fair and he saw plastics. And he goes to the government and he said, I can make a reed out of plastic, but I need this machine. And he got like a $150,000 grant, and he bought this injection molding equipment. And he figured out how to make a plastic reed that actually played very similar to the Ligier reed that's out now. And he was able to sustain the business. But then he decided to make a playable ukulele out of plastic, like in the late 40s. We called it Islander originally. And in 1949, Arthur Godfrey had a very popular variety show on TV. And Godfrey was a very good ukulele player. And he got a hold of one of Mario's Islander ukuleles, played it on TV, and then the next day the phone was ringing off the wall at Mario's factory. Everybody wanted these ukuleles, and he needed strings. and he didn't know where to get all of these strings, and somebody introduced him to our father, and they became friends, and that was our dad's first giant break. He tells his stories about 3 weeks before I was born when he got this first big order from Mario, and he was driving from the Bronx. He kept pulling over in the car to look at the order. He couldn't believe it, because it was so big, and it was like a big opportunity for him. Mario would go on to make anywhere from 7 to 9 million of these ukuleles over the next 15 years, and our family would supply all the strings. Soprano ukulele strings are nothing but monofilament nylon. There's no windings or anything, so there's simple strings to make. In fact, Dad just purchased the nylon from DuPont, and he dyed each string a different color because Mario had a lesson book, so you knew what string was what note by the color. And then they just had a knot every string. So Dad had everyone in our family knotting ukulele strings. You weren't allowed to watch TV without knotting ukulele strings for Mario. This went on for a decade. I always was totally inspired by his factory and the engineers at the drafting tables and all the mold making equipment and everything. It was fascinating. We would go there and Mario would take a break and have an espresso with Dad, and he'd take out his classic guitar and play for me. That was a huge thing for the family. So Dad, he constantly innovated for people if they asked for something. In the early 50s, Nate Daniels founded the Danelectro Company, and he was making low-priced instruments for Sears as Silvertone. He eventually started using the Danelectro brand name. And the Danelectro instruments, they weren't fancy guitars. They were solid bodies, birch wood bodies, and vinyl trim and stuff, and some of them looked like they were Formica almost. But they sounded good, and they sold a lot of them. Dad developed the round-wound electric guitar and bass strings that were used on all of the Danelectro instruments. They were kind of unique for the time. He didn't know that would eventually become the de facto standard that everybody would want on an electric bass string and an electric guitar string. The Danelectro bass string was so good, John Entwistle of The Who, when they were recording the first album, My Generation, he had a Danelectro bass, and he took the strings off and put them on his Fender. And he broke a string, and Danelectro never sold replacement strings. He went to the store and bought 2 more basses to get new strings because he wanted that bright sound. If you listen to that solo, My Generation is really bright bass sound. And he was famous for that. Eventually they couldn't get the strings. My dad didn't have anything to do with Danelectro's marketing. They never had replacement strings. So John Entwistle worked with James Howe, and they developed the Rotosound bass string. So then Dad got better and better at making steel core strings. He started to get the original equipment business and private label business from a lot of the really great guitar companies, particularly Martin, which would become his biggest customer. But he made strings for Guild and Gretsch and Gibson and Fender and just about everybody. And in 1959, the family business was still located in the basement of our grandparents' home. My grandfather was ready to retire. He was 65. Dad started to work with 2 other gentlemen from Italy, Alberto Moranti and Gino Borelli. And they started a separate little business sometime around 1955-56 in a storefront on Astoria Boulevard. And Dad would go there at night and help them. They were making the steel core guitar strings there. And when my grandfather retired, they decided to merge the 2 companies together, and that became Darko Music Strings in 1962. And my brother John, who was about 18 or 19, he was able to go full-time work at Darko and was to become one of the partners. So Dad, my brother, and these other 2 gentlemen were equal partners in the business. My brother John, he learned a lot about running a business. He took a couple of years of accounting in college, and he really had a good background in finance, and he became the backbone of the business, doing the payroll and doing the detailed accounting work and the billing and all that stuff every day. He learned every aspect of that. When Darko was starting to get some traction and was actually growing, they were still making orchestral strings, but they weren't making the same profit margin on orchestral strings, and it was difficult to get the raw gut that you needed to make the cores and the guitar was booming, and they couldn't make enough guitar strings. Dad and my brother decided to discontinue making orchestral strings. So from about 1963 to 1981, when we acquired the Kaplan String Company, we didn't make orchestral strings anymore, which was really what the heritage of the family was. In the 30s and 40s, the Bethlehem Steel Wire Company made some really great round steel wire with a zinc plating on it. They called it Bethanized wire. And the plating kept it from tarnishing, and it was a very highly magnetic, low carbon steel that they had this plating on. Dad started using that to make some of the D'Angelico and Guild electric guitar strings, and they were nice and bright sounding, and intonation was perfect, and the wire was very inexpensive but high quality. And then suddenly, sometime in the late 50s, Bethlehem Steel shut that plant down. So we lost that really great sounding round wire alloy that we loved. We had to search for something else. Dad, very curious guy, and he also doesn't take no for an answer at that time. He would just keep plugging away. He found nickel-plated steel, which was quite similar. It was the same steel wire, but with a nickel plating on it instead of a zinc plating. Eventually he found out that GTE Sylvania in Warren, Pennsylvania was making incandescent light bulbs there by the millions. And part of that process back then in their factory was to put a nickel-plated steel wire to hold the tungsten filament, and then they would dip it in an acid that would burn away the nickel-plated steel, but not the tungsten. And they had a big wire plant making nickel-plated steel just for that purpose. And then eventually, when fluorescent bulbs came out, they had less and less demand, and they had this wire drawing capability, and Dad convinced them to make wire for us. And for years, they were our major supplier of nickel-plated steel, and they made beautiful nickel-plated steel wire. But it was a journey of, like innovation by accident at times, but still innovation. And that nickel-plated steel string would be adopted by people and other brands that didn't really use a round wound wire. Like all of Fender strings were pure nickel squeezed as they were winding it semi-flat. So was Ernie Ball. It wasn't until later on that Ernie Ball adopted nickel-plated steel as well. So now nickel-plated steel is very, very popular. But all of that came from this whole Darko era where Dad was developing things for other people. But he never knew how to market them himself. And they also felt strongly that they didn't want to put the family name on product in the marketplace. They felt that it was hard to pronounce. You hear D'Addario, D'Addario. We had some t-shirts where we had Dario. They were pretty popular. But they didn't want to put the family name on the business because they felt that there was still a bit of discrimination against Italian Americans. It wasn't until August of '74 that we branded the first strings with the D'Addario name. So in the interim, we were transitioning from making a lot of private labels like D'Angelico, then D'Acquisto, and then Dad started trying to make like a Darko New Yorker string. And this little package here was the first thing my wife Janet tried to design when she was 17 or 18 years old. We were in high school because my father didn't know anything about packaging or anything, neither did we. But that was like one of the first. She drew that by hand. And this is like some later iterations of the Darko packaging. It was kind of cultish. People that knew it loved it because they knew the strings were great, but we didn't have the distribution, and it really wasn't Dad's thing. He wasn't really capable of strategizing how to brand something and get it to a marketplace. It was like 7 or 8 years later that the company was merged with Martin Guitars. Martin had become such a big customer for them, so they acquired Darko. It was the biggest thing they purchased that actually is still effectively a commercially viable entity. But at that time, we had no money. After selling the company, we were just basically broke. So it was a bit of a challenge because we would have to scratch, steal, borrow, scrape up every penny we needed to start this company.